Welcome to the Employee Advocacy and Influence podcast. My name is Bradley Keenan. I'm the founder and CEO of DSMN8, and with me, I have the star of the show, Lewis Gray.
I will take that. So today we're going to be talking about the...
Hold on. You're jumping straight into the topic, Lewis. I've got something I want to talk to you about live on the pod.
Oh, go on then, live. Let's have it.
So obviously previously I was doing the podcast by myself. And
is this technically a recorded conversation? Is this like a disciplinary live on the podcast?
Yeah, well, it's not. It's just something I want to air, and I thought it'd be better to do it on the podcast. So obviously I used to do the podcast by myself, and the thumbnail on Spotify was just me. And I noticed that you've now been put on the thumbnail as well.
Mm-hmm.
So you're now permanent. I take that as you're permanently on the podcast now.
Oh yeah, I assumed that was the case anyway, but it probably doesn't.
What I liked about it was that because my picture is me on top of where the balcony at the office is, and you've kind of also you're looking the other way, so it looks like we're together, and it's also the correct height between me and you. So there's like a slight difference in height, and I wondered over time if you're slightly going to make yourself bigger and me smaller until I faded out and you've become the icon and star of the Employee Advocacy podcast.
Okay, absolutely not my intention, but I'm also so glad that you noticed that, because that was in the back of my mind as I was suggesting the sizes. I was like, if I make me either the same height, Brad's like, for anybody listening, Brad's like, what, you like 6'2"?
Just under 6'2", actually. I don't want to claim 6'2", and I'm not.
Well, let's say 2 inches taller. But yeah, I knew I wouldn't hear the end of it with the podcast cover. I was just kind of adjusting the image sizes. I was like, just make him slightly taller. I don't want to look short, but at the same time, it's just not worth the aggro.
I liked it. It was just like a subtle way of saying I'm here to stay. I'm not going anywhere.
Yeah,
so I think it might have come from me accidentally giving you promotions on previous podcasts. But anyway,
gone straight to my head.
We digress. So what are we speaking about today, Lewis?
Today we're going to be talking about selling employee advocacy into your CFO. So how to pitch it to your CFO to ultimately get sign off. We'll be talking about the business case for employee advocacy as well. So yeah, let's get into it.
Okay, so let's start. I think it's probably a good idea to start with the business case before we actually talk about how to sell employee advocacy into the CFO. So before the podcast, I looked at our own data. Obviously, we have data for all of our clients, but we're a small, medium business. So we're not on the scale that our clients are. But even at our size, the ROI is completely... it can't be denied. So if we buy ad space with LinkedIn, which we do sometimes, but not as frequently as others would, essentially what we pay is about $10 per click. And that is not cheap, especially when converting people is becoming harder to do. So the business case for us is if I buy ad space from LinkedIn, it costs me $10. Through our employee advocacy program, if I look at the last 6 months, using the content we've produced distributed via our employees has cost us about 60 cents per click. And that is what I would consider to be not at scale. So anything sub $1 is, where else are you going to get cost per click rates of that unless you get in a time machine and go back to 1998? So the business case is really clear of why you would do it and the benefits and all those things, but mostly the ROI is really clear. But that doesn't necessarily solve the problem of how do you go about selling it into a CFO. And I think for me, being in sales for a long time, the CFO has always been treated as this kind of like, bogeyman type individual where they're kind of in the back office. You never get to speak to them, but ultimately they sign it off. And to be honest, I think that was kind of a negotiation tactic for years because ultimately people owned their own budgets. But in the economy as it is at the moment, the CFO has kind of become center of any buying decision, and they can kibosh and stop any deal from happening if they don't think that there's tangible value to the company. And even if there is value, they're always going to be comparing that value to other things. So if I took that dollar and I gave it to hire a new salesperson, am I going to get a better ROI than if I launch an employee advocacy program?
Is it, in your experience, Brad, is it always the CFO now? Because, or actually, I'll let you answer before I go off on a tangent.
I think before it was like, yes, the CFO would ultimately manage the budget when it come to, I guess, attributing money and revenue where things go. But department heads, the chief executive, the CMO, for instance, would manage their own budget and would have, responsibility for doing that. But now I do think that a CFO could essentially stop a deal from happening, even if somebody else in the C-suite wanted it to happen. So when you are selling things, you kind of have to frame everything around the value, but the value has to be tied to the actual tangible ROI. And when you work in marketing, that does become difficult to do. And especially if you work in talent and employer branding, especially, it can be so easy to start talking about, I'll call them fluffy things. I don't think they are, but other people would, right? So employee well-being, super important, but to a CFO, do they really deep down believe that is not a fluffy thing to measure? I suspect they probably think it is a fluffy thing to measure.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was speaking to the sales guys here at DSMN8 about this recently. I was kind of surprised because I thought in my mind it was, if you want to get something signed off, if you're working in marketing, for example, you'll go to your CMO who has been allocated budget. But they were saying to me, it's kind of gone almost 100, not 100% CFO, but the CFO always seems to be involved now. So even where before you might have just gone to your CMO to get sign off and to get allocated some of the budget that's already been allocated to the marketing department, because of the current state of the economy, like in the economic climate that we're in, the CMO is just kind of looking at everything under a microscope, going through everything with a fine tooth comb. And like you said, they're not focused on, I don't want to say fluffy either, because I absolutely don't believe it. So I'll say like soft metrics, but I'm not even sure if that's the right phrase. But
well, I think what happened previously is people would have discretionary funds in their own budget. So if I'm a CMO and I'm putting my plan together, I might say, actually, this year I'm going to spend $500,000 on search, and I'm going to spend $1 million on, paid media, wherever I'm, spending that. And I'm going to put aside $500,000 for discretionary things that I know are going to come out throughout the year. And I've always got because no CMO wants to do a job where in January they say what they're going to be spending their money on and then say, see you again in a year's time, because stuff comes up throughout the year. They might get a speaking opportunity to sponsor something which wasn't there in January. So they kind of put an amount of money aside. I think what happened was, as budgets got taken back, that discretionary funds got swallowed up. So there were no discretionary funds, meaning if I want to buy something in July, I now have to actually put a business case together and take it to the business and say, I need more money and this is why I need it. So that's why I think the metrics are so important, and why the CFO is kind of more at the center now.
I think that's the interesting thing with employee advocacy, because a lot of the time when you get into the things that we're going to be talking about, you're almost talking about saving money, because when we're talking about proving the ROI from employee advocacy, we're often talking about the earned media value. So again, a lot of people consider that to be a soft metric. I don't believe that for a second, because I think it's a fantastic way to demonstrate the ROI from employee advocacy. But you're almost talking about saving money with it, because it's like, okay, we generated this through our employee advocacy platform. Like Brad, you said at the beginning, we were able to do through our own one. And it would have cost us this much if we'd continued to pump that same amount of money into, say, LinkedIn ads, for example. Mm-hmm. So there is a conversation there to be had about, if you don't have these discretionary funds available and you have to say, I want more money, you're kind of saying, I want more money, but it's because we want to do something that's potentially more cost effective. Now, when you were talking about the cost per click on LinkedIn at the moment, even if you use conservative averages, so if you said, I think the average cost per click for LinkedIn, I don't want to say an exact figure, but it was between $6 to $9 last year.
I'd love to know what business is paying $6 a click.
Yeah, it's definitely on the higher end.
You'd have to be in such a niche market where you've got no one else competing for that space.
Yeah,
because every time you do a campaign, it gets more and more expensive. But yeah, okay.
But I say it's somewhere between that range. I think it is more the higher end of that range. But the reason I'm mentioning the lower side is because even if you say a conservative average of $6, It's non-comparable still. Like you said, we're looking at less than $1 a click, significantly less. We're looking at 60, I can't remember what it was now, 62 cents a click currently
Hmm.
we're tracking at. Um, Comparing that to what we would have been paying, which is $10 a click, or what we have paid in the past. But even looking at the conservative averages, it's huge. It's a massive money saver.
I mean, to be honest, I used to think about it like where we use comparative media value or comparative media spend as a way of benchmarking the spend. I used to I used to think it was a great way of benchmarking the money, but I didn't think it was equal to. But I've actually changed my view on it, and I'll tell you why. So originally, I thought, well, it's not comparable because if I'm buying ad space, I can say to LinkedIn, I want to target people in this demographic, in this sector, in this industry. You know, whatever I do in, like I would in Sales Navigator, say these are the people I want to go after. So those clicks are in the people I want to attract as clients. As where in an employee advocacy program, you're not choosing who's going to your content. However, if you actually look at the data of the people that actually do click when you spend ads and how that relates to the people you targeted, it's way off anyway. And also, if you're distributing, if you've got people in the business that are sharing content which are actually commercially viable meaning that they either sell your product, they support your customers, they're in your industry, then that should actually be the filter. And also, if those people are using an advocacy program throughout the year, the person in their audience is not seeing the message once or potentially twice, but they're seeing constant brand messaging from that same individual, which, you're the marketing expert, not me, but the more somebody's going to see the brand, the more they're going to recognize it. So actually, when we do our own employee advocacy efforts, when we have our inbound inquiries that come in and people say where they heard about us, I think it's like 70% of people say LinkedIn, yet we don't spend any money on LinkedIn ads, but we
Yeah.
do spend money on search and SEO, and we spend money everywhere else. Yet most of our traffic comes from LinkedIn, in a place that we've got a handful of employees active.
Yeah, and it's interesting. So we allow, when we're asking people to submit forms on our website, we have self-reported attribution. So we'll allow people to. It's just a free text field. People can write whatever they want, and I think it's difficult because we can't say 100% certainty that they've seen some of our employees post, because they will just say LinkedIn. I'd be interested to see what would happen if we changed that to a drop down. It was like, okay, LinkedIn or LinkedIn employees, or somebody you're connected with, just see what that difference was. But just going back to something you were saying before about having the ability to target people within your ICP. In theory, so one of the most common reasons that people launch an employee advocacy platform or program is to leverage social selling to support their sales teams. It can be used as a sales enablement tool. If your salespeople aren't connected to people within your ICP, then you probably need to reassess,
Mm-hmm.
the sales teams that you're hiring, because I don't know. I don't think that argument has any weight to it if you consider it from a sales perspective, because yes, you can target your ICP through ads, but if you're inviting your salespeople and the others who are still going to be connected to people within your ICP, they're going to be pushing your content in front of people who you want to be connected with and who you want to be getting in front. Does that make sense?
Yeah, 100%. So if I said I want to target people at Johnson and Johnson, and I want to target people in marketing in Johnson and Johnson, and in America, let's say, they're not a client, by the way. So let's say I was trying to, and by the way, Johnson and Johnson, if you are listening, feel free to pick up a call. We're happy to have a conversation. But let's say I was targeting Johnson and Johnson. Now, the sales guys that have that account named as their named account, they will have already contacted the specific people in marketing that we know we sell to. So that's going to be the social media team, the employer branding team. It's not going to be their field marketing team. Highly unlikely. As where if I do it through LinkedIn ads, I'm going to be displaying ads to people who work in the field marketing team. So actually, I can get far more specific, providing that my employees are doing it. But I think we digress a little bit because we're talking about
The
how
business
to,
case.
so actually going to the CFO and taking this idea to them. I think the main things to focus on is removing the fluff from the proposal. I think that's what you were saying before about it being a cost-saving exercise. So anything that talks about brand exposure, etc., like, although as marketeers we're going to see the value in it, a CFO probably isn't. So focusing on that, this is what it costs to buy ad space. This is what it costs to buy SEO, or not buy SEO, but by positioning in Google. This is what it costs to buy a LinkedIn ad. This is what an employee advocacy lead costs. I want to spend more on that and less on the others because it will give us a better return, is a far better business case than I want to an employee advocacy tool because our employees should be seen as thought leaders, as an example. Because I think if you said that, that would probably, by a CFO at least, would probably get thrown out.
Yeah, definitely. I think you can still talk about social selling and talk about how that affects the bottom line without kind of getting into the fluffy stuff. So long as you just bring the right stats with you, I would say as well. So your sales teams are ultimately going to be the people that are impacting that bottom line, right? Those are the ones who are converting the leads, or those are the people that are converting the leads that your company's generating. There's so many social selling statistics out there. Like the one that springs to mind for me is there's an IBM stat from years ago that was, well, say years ago, it's like 2 years ago, but leads generated through employee advocacy are 7 times more likely to convert. So I'm not saying lead with statistics, but just bring that kind of thing with you. So once you've kind of gone through the cost saving and that kind of thing, you can lean into this data just to kind of give your point a little bit more weight. You can say, and on top of that, the leads that we are generating for this reduced cost, they're not only cheaper to generate, but they're also like, X amount. I think it was 7 times. I don't want to misquote here, but let's say 7 times more likely to convert.
Yeah, and there's another part to this as well, where we naturally think about sales, right, as more customers joining us. But actually what businesses care about is revenue. And revenue and sales, okay, they're intrinsically linked, but revenue comes from existing clients. And in an economy where people are looking at, where am I spending my money? Is this valuable? Do I need to look at alternative vendors? Actually having an employee advocacy program means that your employees are talking to your existing customers in a passive way to show them all of the new things that are coming out in your product, all of your releases, your webinars, all those kind of things, to essentially build a protective moat around the existing clients that people have. So I think there's a retention message in it as well, as much as there is about generating leads. And I think when you talk to a CFO, talking about generating leads, again, is probably a fluffy number. What we care about is new revenue, protecting revenue and growth. And I think if the message of those 3 things is covered in a business case, and you can prove that in 6 months and 12 months, you can demonstrate that clearly, that's a much better message than, the more marketing led one, I would say.
So I'd be interested to pick your brains on something, Brad, because I think this is slightly up for debate with regards to trialing employee advocacy. Do you think there's any value in maybe trying it for a month, if you're able to trial an employee advocacy program for a month, 2 months, 3 months, whatever you can get, to then take that to your CFO and say, look, we were able to generate this within our 30-day trial, just to bring those stats with you?
Yes and no. So I think there's the concept of trialing software is different to the concept of trialing employee advocacy. And I think the things get mixed. So for us, if we were to say to somebody, here's our software, right, you can go and press loads of buttons. Does the button do what I think it's going to do? If it doesn't, you've got a big problem. But we're going to assume that it does. Now, launching an employee advocacy program properly in a large organization is not something you're going to do in 1 week. You've got to build comms plans. You've got to test and learn. How do we approach employees? What's our positioning? All those kind of things that you're just not going to do in a trial, because you wouldn't do that to trial something for a week, because it would be a huge upfront investment for something that ultimately you don't know whether you're going to want to continue doing it. So I think a technical assessment on software is absolutely, you should always do that with anything you buy. It'd be like buying a car and not test driving it. You don't know if you like the car or not. We're going to assume the car drives, but someone might like one style of car versus another. However, data points are really easy to to work out. So even before speaking to an employee advocacy company, you could get, 5 employees together, 5 or 10, create some content, put it behind a trackable URL, and ask them to share it. Now, if you ask 10 of them to share it and 4 of them share it, you've got an appetite of 40%. Once they share it, how many people click on that link? That gives me the clicks per share. So those data points can then be used to model out, well, actually, if we got 20% of our employees to adopt this, it would generate this, which would equal this in comparative media spend. That can be done in an afternoon without using any software, because the software is there to help you scale it. It's not designed to create the appetite for employee advocacy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does, 100%. I think I don't think I know. We have calculators for this kind of thing as well, which we'll drop in the show notes if you wanted to get an idea of the ROI you could expect to see from employee advocacy, because I think this is a nice way of doing what you've just mentioned, Brad. But basically, the calculator will just allow you to enter your total number of employees, what percentage of them you expect to join the platform, sign up to the platform. Be conservative with it. So I would say if you wanted 20, try 10. If you have like 1,000 employees, if you want 20% to be signed up, I think we see on average about 30 to 40%. But try 20 and then try 10. Get the conservative averages. It will then just ask you the amount you're currently paying on LinkedIn, per click, and it will just tell you what you could expect to see if that conservative average that you've put in to the calculator was regularly sharing your content. And I think even just taking that in with you again, it just gives you some. I don't want to keep using fluffy metrics, soft metrics, whatever. I think that's a hard metric for you to take into this conversation, because you don't have to trial it. You can literally just use this calculator. Okay, worst case scenario, this is what happens, and we're still saving money.
Yeah, it's a really good point. And I think on that, I think there's one other bit of advice I would give people, and that is when you're pitching the idea to a CFO, stay away from talking about user numbers, because talk about the outputs, the cost per click, the comparative media value, all those hard metrics we've spoken about. The actual amount of users is somewhat irrelevant. So what can happen is, let's say you buy an employee advocacy platform, whether it's ours or somebody else's, there's going to be a user limit in there. And of course, we want to sell people the biggest employee advocacy program we can. But actually, what we've learned over the years is that that's not the right thing to do. So starting with a reasonable amount of people that you actually want to adopt is better than going and buying 10,000 licenses when you haven't launched 500. Because what can happen is, let's say you bought 10,000 licenses, you got to 5,000, your ROI was 50x, 100x, whatever it is. There is a risk that the CFO could look at that in a year's time and say, hey, how many of the 10,000 licenses, how many people are using it? And then you say, well, only half. They go, oh, okay, so we're only getting half the value than we originally wanted. Even though the output's actually greater, the license usage is less. So I would say, start with a reasonable amount and get to that point, reach it, grow it over time. It's a far better way of doing it. I'm not saying start with 5 people. You still have to start with a number that's economically viable, because the amount of effort you need to put in as a program leader needs to have an output, and there'll be an equation to do that.
So are you saying don't overshoot from the start? Like don't shoot for like 200 users if realistically you're only going to get 50, because could that potentially look worse on you a year down the line? I
think so. And I think the misunderstanding is that because this is an employee app or employee program, that it's for all employees. So if I've got 2,000 employees, am I going to have 2,000 employees in my employee advocacy program? No. I'd love to say yes, but actually the value to the individual gets diminished based on the total percentage of employees that use it. Really, like we said before in other podcasts, you want to think about strategic people who really have a invested interest in using it. So if that's 40% of your workforce, then that's fine. If you're going for 100%, unless you're a startup or a really small company, I would say shooting for 100 is probably going to cause you more issues than you would want.
Yeah, definitely. So let's say, Brad, you're a You've promoted me accidentally a few times on the podcast. So I'm going to demote you down to somebody who's trying to get budget signed off.
Oh, I don't like the feeling of this.
Let's roll back the years.
Right.
Let's go back to those junior positions.
Yeah.
You're trying to get sign off on something. Let's say it's an employee advocacy platform. Well, let's definitely say it's an employee advocacy platform. What are your three things, your three pieces of advice, your three takeaways? What are you taking to that meeting with the CFO?
So I'm going to keep it quite simple as a basic business case. So what are the current business risks? So in the current economy, what are the business risks? Okay, we have less marketing budget, which means less brand exposure. We could be losing market share to our competitors. Risk one. Risk two, our clients are reevaluating what they're spending money on, and we want to make sure that we can communicate with them consistently and in a cost-effective way. And risk three is maybe our workforce is maybe it's declined, and we need to do more with less. So we need to more with less people, more with less marketing budget. And then how are we going to do this? So from an employee advocacy perspective, we want to make our content work for harder for us. So we're going to, the basic fundamentals of DSMN8. Here's what we're going to do. Here's the business case. If X% of our employees sign up, backed up by this piece of data that we've tested already, like we said earlier, each employee will share, let's say it's average is 2.2 pieces of content a week. Now, if 40% of people share 2.2 pieces of content a week and an average click per share of 5, it would equate to that amount of web traffic. Now I'm going to compare that to buy that from LinkedIn would cost me X, to buy it from search would cost me Y, to buy it using employee advocacy program is 1/100th of the cost at this. To me, that's the simple business case and a kind of yes or no, and that should be able to be done on a one-pager. You could add in kind of like metrics and KPIs over time to say after 6 months we expect it to be this, after 12 months we expect it to be that, but it's pretty straightforward stuff, to be honest.
Do you think, obviously we've been, apologies because I know I said sort of to summarize there, but just an afterthought, do you think it's worth saying, obviously at the moment we're focusing on a lot of the points that we've mentioned because of the current economic climate, is it worth saying as well to try hone in on the current business goals when you're going into these meetings?
Yeah, naturally. I mean, obviously everyone's going to have different business goals, but I think at the moment most people are going to have a few common ones, which is retain existing clients, grow, be profitable, all those kind of things that have seem to have only just become in fashion. So yeah,
this podcast was actually just an episode for me to pick your brains about how I'm going to get sign off next time I need something. So this is
good luck with that.
I'm going to pull the episode up, be like, this is what you said. But no, I think that's a nice place to wrap up. I don't know if there's anything else you wanted to run through, Brad.
No, the only thing I would say is, as you are looking at things like this, I mean, personally, I wouldn't be afraid of, obviously it depends on the salesperson's credibility that you're speaking to. And this is not just employee advocacy, this is any vendor. If the salesperson has credibility, why not bring the CFO onto those calls as well? And let them kind of, press a few buttons and, put some pressure on a salesperson to explain the business case. Because if the proposal, whether that's EA or any other piece of tech, the company should be pretty well versed in explaining the value of their proposition from a financial perspective and not just from a features and benefits perspective.
Love that. Awesome. All right. Well, as mentioned, while we've been speaking, we'll pop any of these resources or any resources we've mentioned will be in the show notes below. If you wanted to connect with myself and Brad, obviously you can do that on LinkedIn. It's the best place to do it. And yeah, thank you very much for listening. We'll catch you next week.